apologies from Councillor Pandor, Councillor Hinchcliffe, and also Councillors Jeffries, Swift, and Mark Roberts, for whom the substitutes are in attendance or expected.
Thank you very much. Lovely. And declarations of interest. Any members, any interest they wish to declare? No. Item 3, exclusion of press and public's not required. Item 4, minutes of the meetings. Everybody content with the minutes? Yeah, thank you. And governance arrangements. If you want to just quickly talk us through it, as this is our first meeting of FRCC.
I will, thank you. Yeah, we're bringing one of these papers to each of the committees just to confirm the arrangements that were agreed at the annual meeting of the Combined Authority last month. So it is here for information. The decision has been already made by the Combined Authority, so it's just setting out their confirmation for you of the terms of reference, the quorum, the chair and deputy chair arrangements, and so the terms of reference are attached as the appendix. So there for information. If anyone has questions, happy to take them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And moving on to next item, which is the financial performance report. So that's over to Angela and then Dave.
It is. Thank you. So the we bring you a paper each time on financial performance. The focus this time is on the final financial position for 2021-22. We have now completed the financial close for the year. We've undertaken all the checks, reconciliations, and are now on with drafting the annual account, which will be published in draft at the end of this month. The first section of the paper looks at the revenue budget, and Appendix A sets out the closing position, and in your pack it's summarised from sort of paragraph 2.2, the bottom of page 15 onwards. When we brought the budget for approval to the Combined Authority in February, we gave a reforecast for the current year where we were hoping to be able to deliver a contribution to reserves of around £2 million, which would be predominantly as a result of reductions we'd achieved on our concessionary travel payments. In the end, we've ended up with a slightly improved position on that, with a surplus of 2.8 million. That's made up of a combination of elements. The most significant of those is firstly staffing, and that's simply reflecting the challenges of recruiting staff. It's not been holding vacancies, it's just been the volume of posts created and the delay in recruiting to them, or vacancies when people have moved post. The other big chunk of movement is around transport services. So we knew we were expecting an underspend on concessionary travel. That's come in slightly higher than we expected. That's coming at 4.2 million, but we also have an overspend on tendered services of 1.1 million. Agenda item 8 later on this paper picks up more detail about that overspend and then goes into more information about how that's going to impact on this year's budget and future year's budget, and also draws in the risks and challenges facing the whole complex area of bus support. So we can pick up that in more detail if you like in that item, and Dave will talk us through the detail on that paper. Also at the February budget meeting, we got an in principle, I suppose it was, approval to ring fencing what we hope would be 2 million of savings on concessionary travel. The intention that we would ring fence that to be put aside to be used to support bus in whatever way the Combined Authority chooses this year or next. So this paper is asking for a decision on that as agreed at the Combined Authority. We were able to confirm that there is a 2 million surplus that we can put aside. And again, we'll pick it up probably with paper from Dave later, that we'll put that in an earmarked reserve to support public transport spend. And then there will be decisions to be made later this year about taking into account all the moving parts around concessions, operator potential deregistrations, inflation, all the other aspects, and BSIP, when that is confirmed, how bus service improvement plan money, how all that comes together and how we use that in supporting bus. So that's a recommendation that you're being asked to make today. The second part of the paper then looks at the final position on the capital budget, and it is a little lower than forecast in February, but still gives us 253 million of spend, which is a positive position. there've been a lot of challenges for us and our partner authorities in delivering the big infrastructure projects over the last year. And the paper then sets out a little bit of narrative on each of the main sort of funding programmes, explaining some of the challenges we've had, some of the successes as well, because there's been some, we're almost there on the Leeds Public Transport Improvement Programme, the Getting Building Fund is almost there. There's a little bit of carry over to this current year, but that's almost done. So there's some good results in there. There is a bit of a graph at the bottom of page 22 showing the way that this sort of spend is expected to grow, funded by new income and also funded by some of the, we expect in turn by gain share approvals, where we've got in principle allocations against areas of spend. There are no decisions required on this. There's a lot of information in that section on capital project, and either myself or Melanie's here also to take any questions you may have on any aspect of that. So I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Just before we open it up, one question I have is that colleagues are always telling me that the pothole funding and road maintenance is really important, but there's a balance remaining of 21 million, and you'd think, well, everybody would want to spend every penny of that. So where's the challenge in spending that, Melanie?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. The allocations have been awarded to partners, and we're just waiting for the final returns to come in. So at the moment we don't have the evidence of spend, but we're being told that they've spent up, or they're going to spend up in this first quarter. So we're just waiting for those final returns.
Thank you. Do colleagues have any comments before we move on to the buses? No, thank you. Oh yes, Jane.
Just a quick one. I want to say thank you to the staff for getting the outturn report by this time, and it's a very good effort, and the budget pretty much is on target, actually. So given how difficult a year it's been, actually I think that's fantastic, committee. And we're just still dealing with all the post-pandemic stuff, and also I thank you for being very clear about the different revenue streams and the different capital streams, although I have to say the opacity of bus funding remains still a bit of a mystery to me, really. So I look forward to the next item.
Morning, Mandy. Good to see you. No worries at all. No worries, and you're very welcome. In your first attendance at FRCC? Yes. So Mandy, we're just on item, which item is it? 6, thank you. We're just on item 6. And moving on to bus finance. Dave, do you want to talk us?
Do you want to do item 7 first?
Sure. We'll move on, that makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Okie dokie, so moving on to item 7, which is the inflationary pressures. Oh yeah, that's right, on capital programmes. So if you'd like to talk to that, Melanie?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We've all been experiencing the inflationary pressures, and particularly across our capital programmes. I know that partner councils have been looking at this for their capital programmes as well, and we said we'd bring a discussion report back to this committee. So we are seeing more and more issues across our programmes. The programme that at the moment is most affected is the Transport Fund. We put together that programme in 2012, and a lot's happened in 10 years. We also had an ambition to deliver that within a 10-year period when we got an approval to start in 2015. So we're coming towards the end of that period, but for a variety of reasons, we still have a number of schemes that are left to run within that programme. So we were looking at what's the implications for the spend that's already been committed, and is there a way of reprioritising some of the schemes so that we can push ahead with those that are ready to go ahead, but maybe we can slow down some of the delivery of those that are not quite ready in terms of getting to a key decision point. So we started by looking at the Transport Fund. What we found was this is affecting every programme. So on TCF, we put forward the scheme 3 years ago with a 3% assumption for inflation, which was right at the time. Obviously, that's clearly nowhere near the current inflation rates. And at the moment, we haven't over-programmed on that programme, but we've got a risk pot which has been allocated in principle. So we're sort of at the point on TCF where we've allocated all the funds. And you may recall that when we put the bid into government, we had 3 different scenarios for the bidding. and we had what was the core scenario, the lowest one, ranging right up to the high scenario. And at that time, we were awarded the core scenario, and members agreed to fund the high scenario programme using gain share funding. So we've already topped up and used our allocation of capital for gain share to top up the TCF programme, which is now sort of pushing at the boundaries in terms of the funding that we've got. And then we've got CRSTS programme, where we've only just put the bid in last year, making an assumption of 7% inflation, and we're already higher than that now. So we're going to have to make some decisions about which projects can move ahead and which ones we need to pause. Maybe we need to put them back onto the strategic pipeline so that when funding does become available, we're able to then allocate schemes immediately to say, right, we've got one ready for that fund. Because funding opportunities do come up, and we then start to work up new schemes. Well, actually, we've got an opportunity to put some of those schemes that were already in the programmes, but at the moment we haven't got enough money for everything to put them on the reserve list. We've also had lots of discussions with partner council officers, so chief highways officers, directors of development, chief execs, to talk about how can we manage this across the programmes. And to date, what we've been doing is looking at individual projects, value engineering wherever possible, so cutting out some cost, but you still want to gain the maximum benefits. And I think we're at the limit of where we can go with value engineering and still get those benefits, because we're having to de-scope and rescope and redesign. And all of this, of course, is adding time that then is adding cost because of the inflationary costs. So we need to identify those that can move ahead and those that can't. We've set out a series of options here, and the option that we're proposing is option 5, which is look at where there are some high-risk projects that we could pause. So let's have a look at all the projects across the programmes and have a look at those where there's an issue with affordability, there's an issue with deliverability, and it's not just about the funding, it could be about the resource to actually move all these projects forward. And then finally, let's have a look at the strategic fit, because things have changed over the last 10 years. We're now looking at more as a priority at sustainable transport and active travel, so walking and cycling. You know, have we got those features in the schemes, and do we need to have a re-look at that strategic fit? So the proposal here is that we go with that option, and we have discussions with each of our partners and with our delivery teams as well within the combined authority, and look at where we can identify some schemes where we could pause them, maybe even stop them if we feel they're no longer such a high priority, and actually allow us to then move forward with the ones that we think are a higher priority. If we do nothing, what will happen is those that come forward first will spend the money, and then we'll run out of money. And actually what we want to ensure is that we get the strategic schemes through, not just the first that can come forward. So that's why we're proactively trying to manage it now rather than just leave it as we are. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take any questions.
Can I just check, obviously CRSTS hasn't been completely signed off. Has it been paused because of government chaos?
We're being told that it will be signed off, and it will be signed off, you know, over the next few weeks. We'll wait and see what happens to them. We've had the first couple of tranches of payment paid to us, so we have some funding, so we are pressing ahead with approvals that relate to CRSTS, but we haven't got the final sign-off.
Thank you, Ben.
Just to add to Melanie's answer, so we do have the first year, but the confirmation of the future years, we are hoping government will make that decision before it goes into recess next Thursday.
Wow, okay.
So it's going to be, we should know within a week, but we're hopeful.
Thank you. So we are at the moment proceeding at risk, aren't we? Now, I've felt all along that with these inflationary pressures, everybody has to take the hit. It can't just be one, local authority where their project seems the furthest away from delivery. Every partner must identify a project so that it's fair and equitable. Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. We was talking about this at Wakefield last week. Some of our capital monies are all, a lot of pressure on them as well. One of our schemes is being delivered. It's on the ground. They're building it. That's potentially go £2.5 million over budget already. another scheme that we haven't even started, we require properties for to make the scheme, that's potentially £1.5 million. As Wakefield, we're more than happy to work with you about identifying, we can't let them schemes not happen, but there's some schemes on there we feel we do want to pull out of. But as long as we can get guarantees from yourself and the Combined Authority that them budget gaps will be plugged by the Combined Authority, there's no money in Wakefield to do that. Do we have them assurances?
I mean, we've always managed these programmes as a single strategic pot. We've never identified an allocation for each of the partner councils. We've always run it collectively. And when we identify any potential savings, or if something is going to pause, then some allocation might go back into the pot. We've always done that collectively, and it's gone back into what we call the central pot before it's allocated. Every partner is going to have to identify some schemes that we can either stop or pause, but that has to be on the understanding that you will also have some schemes that are just ready to go into delivery where the costs have gone up, and that's why we're trying to make that possible, to get some of those schemes that are so far developed now that we want to get them on site. But we all have to work to those principles together. So if we all work on the assumption that there is going to be some funding that is put back into the pot, then we can reallocate some of that to those schemes that really need it. So that is the basis on which we're working. But we're looking across the programmes, because it's quite difficult to manage that within the allocation on a programme by programme basis. So we'll look at it across the portfolio. But that's the intention, that if you're giving up some funding in one area, but there's some really urgent requirement for some schemes to have additional funding to allow them to get into delivery, then that's what we want to look at.
So you are saying that funding will give some funding up, we will look to allocate that funding
That is the
to where it's
principle.
going over budget.
That's the principle that we've all been working to. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Mandy.
So I haven't been here before, so I might have missed the mark with this, but this is about funding budget. But some of the things you're talking about mention land and buildings. So because the value of those has gone up over the pandemic, is there an opportunity to restructure any of the values in the balance sheet to release not cash but to release into the pot?
Excellent point, spot on, Mandy.
I think that for some of those commercial schemes, yes, we might be able to do that. Most of the portfolio at the moment that we're talking about that's in flight are transport infrastructure schemes. So you often don't have a site that you could then sell on. You actually need the site for the actual infrastructure, not the commercial development.
I understand that. What I mean is that if you revalue it in your balance sheet, although it doesn't give you cash, but what it does give you is more, it doesn't give you liquidity, but it does give you a different bottom line. So I don't know if it works like that within WICA, but it would in a private business.
Thank you, Angela. This is why you're here, Mandy. Thank you. Angela.
It's a very good question. Our assets are primarily bus stations, and bus stations are valued in a slightly odd way because they are quite a unique type of property to own. And if you valued them as bricks and mortar, that wouldn't give the true value of what they're used for. So I don't think there's any games we can play. I understand what you're saying about revaluing and using that to find funding. I'll take it away and look at it again, but I think the nature of our assets make that difficult.
Yeah, it might also be worth, if you do have any that aren't, looking at your depreciation, because you can change your depreciation policy, which might, again, won't give you cash, but it would give you more movement within your balance sheet and P&L, potentially.
Great suggestions, thank you. I'm sure Angela will take those away. I mean, for me, we've got to come to a conclusion quite swiftly on this, because every region has got an argument why a particular project must go ahead. And I just urge everyone to work with our officers to try and identify those projects. And they're not scrapped, they're just put onto the shelf for the pipeline. And we've been saying that the reason why we identified the capacity top slice for Gainshare is to help with capacity in local authorities, but to build a pipeline of projects. So this just adds to those projects. And I know it'll be frustrating and disappointing and politically tricky, but every region has to find something so that we can deal with these inflationary pressures. Otherwise, it's going to be incredibly difficult going into the autumn. Any thoughts, James?
I generally agree, but again, it's been clear around. We always know when you start off, some schemes have a higher risk and some schemes have a lower risk. And I think it's been clear around where those pressures are and what we can put back a little bit.
And Jane, from Calderdale's point of view?
Likewise, really. And when I read through the 6 options, it was clear that option 5 was going to be the one that, in partnership, we need to work through, really.
Thank you. So are we happy to agree option 5? We are? Thank you. Rightio, thanks very much. Yes, Ben.
Just can I make a couple of closing points?
Please.
The first is that the combined authority papers, which we're looking to publish towards the end of this week, include a paper that also looks at cost inflation through the lens of the capital side, but also then looking at corporate and other responses to the cost inflation pressures that West Yorkshire faces. That's the first point. Second point is, I think Melanie made this point, but I think it's worth repeating that we don't want any review of projects to pause delivery. So the worst thing we can end up with actually is an underspend because people have been held up reassessing rather than getting on with delivery. So I know that Melanie's telling the teams to press on with that, and we'll just need to keep an eye on that over the coming year. And then thirdly, I'm sure there was something in Mandy's point about next year's accounts and the impacts of land values and looking at depreciation in the challenge of trying to balance next year's accounts. That's a really good point.
Thank you so much, Ben. Brilliant. Okay, moving on to bus service revenue funding and expenditure. I tried to get you into the debate earlier, Dave, but now this is your moment. You have the floor.
It's okay. Thank you. I think, this follows on from Angela's report and sort of gives you a little bit more detail in terms of where we are with both the bus services expenditure and the concessionary fares. I'll talk to each in turn. I think it's worth just bearing in mind how the sort of funding and finance of this has worked over the pandemic, because clearly the pandemic has reduced a lot of cash flow through the bus system through fewer people travelling, and that's been made up of a combination of government grant and local government and combined authority specifically having continued to make the payments it was making to bus companies regardless of the reduced amount of passenger carrying. So so that sort of kept the bus system reasonably stable through the sort of 2020 and early 2021 period, and then towards the end of 21, the sort of final 2 quarters of last financial year, then that started to unravel a little bit, and as evidenced in Angela's report as well. And so what this report's seeking to do is just to put a little bit of context and explanation around that initially, because these things started to happen towards the end of last financial year, then the full year effect is quite significantly more in this financial year. So a number of different factors that are coming into play here. Firstly, it's worth remembering our bus services expenditure is broadly in school buses and in our sort of intervention into the wider network. And in school buses, quite a lot of the provision is with SME contractors, and as fuel prices and labour prices started to go up, then they either invoked existing contract provisions in terms of inflationary payments, or they sought some compensation within the contract. Otherwise, they might have walked away from the contract. So we've had to do quite a lot of that in terms of stabilising and maintaining the school bus provision with contractors who are facing the inflationary impacts that we've just been talking about. Added to that, we've seen particularly in the Wakefield and Kirklees areas, reduced some services towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and some services were reinstated with other operators to cover for that. Overall, the sort of fare revenue has been down on the services where the combined authority sort of nets the fares off the contract value. So quite a lot of impacts that are sort of all sort of coinciding to creating an overspend in this area that is going to be over 2 million in the year to come. So I think there's a significant sort of set of issues there. Government funding for COVID-related bus costs comes to an end in October. We've had £2 million worth of that funding in this financial year. The government have been quite clear that that funding will come to an end as well. So that's factored into these figures as well. So it creates quite a lot of volatility, I think, as we said earlier, in terms of bus service costs. And by and large, across all of this, we've maintained the existing provision and added a little bit more for the withdrawn services. So we haven't taken any school buses away, but we have had to absorb the additional costs that are coming out of that. So that broadly covers where we are in terms of the bus services budgets, and I'm happy to take questions about that. But I'll move into the concessionary fare expenditure, which is a slightly different sort of set of scenarios, but all coming from the same route. The concessionary fares, for those of you less familiar on the committee, this is where the combined authority basically makes up the difference between what the passenger actually pays, and in the case of the free bus pass, the passenger doesn't pay anything, to what the bus operators are entitled to have through the legislation to be no better, no worse. So, and it's our biggest area of revenue spend outside of our staffing budget is concessionary fares, and largely that's a national scheme. The free bus pass scheme for older people and people with disabilities is the national scheme, and we use this money to compensate the bus operators for carrying people for free, largely. We also have a scheme for reducing fares for under 19s. As part of the COVID arrangements, government asked local authorities to continue paying using the passengers we were seeing before the pandemic, and the combined authority agreed to do that. We went into this process in 2020 making a slight downward adjustment in spend anyway, because we'd come to the end of a 3-year arrangement based upon an average of passenger numbers, and that so we went into it with a slight underspending anyway, and so that sort of prevailed for 2021, and then as bus operators started to reduce services because of the driver shortages which they were facing, and that started around about October of last year, we made compensatory reductions in what we paid them for the mileage that they weren't running. So that sort of accumulates the underspend that Angela referred to in the last financial year, and that continues to be the case in the current financial year. The arrangements the government have asked local authorities to do is to transition back to using the actual number of people we see presenting passes on the bus in a sort of series of steps until that equalises, and we expect that to if we reduce the amount that we're spending, we're paying them by 5% a month, or reduce them, sorry, I'll start again. We reduce the number of passengers we're basing the calculations on by 5% per month. That should get us to around about paying on actuals around about March. If more people travel, then that would happen sooner. And that's the arrangement that government did. Curiously, government cut their own funding dead in October, but asked local government to continue for the rest of the financial year. That will also accumulate a level of underspend as well. We also have the threat, I think as we've discussed at Transport Committee and the Combined Authority, that when this funding comes to an end, bus operators may seek to withdraw more services and put the Combined Authority under more pressure to reinstate services. We don't know the full shape of that yet, and we expect to know that in coming weeks. But that's another sort of risk in all of this sort of fairly volatile situation. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there are many questions.
Thank you so much, Dave. When do we think the BSIP money is going to be accessible?
Again, it's a little bit like the CRSTS. I mean, we think it's going to be signed off before the recess. We have a discussion with senior civil servant on Thursday to understand what the rumours that are around bus fares and a national scheme of bus fares are, and how that affects the BSIP proposition that we've put forward. Assuming the BSIP is successful, then obviously we'd want to move fairly quickly to start deploying that money. It's towards the end of the calendar year, ideally, and I think the
It's my agent.
but it's worth sort of reflecting on the implications of the BSIP money in this particular picture, because the BSIP money will come in two forms. One, around fares, and that would be the thing we want to move soonest on, and about sort of 45% of it is on bus networks issue. I think that the trap we don't want to fall into is to find yourselves in a position where we're starting to use that money to prop up withdrawn services. So I think we've got a bit of a navigation of this over the coming months to be able to do that, so that we can use the BSIP funding to strengthen the network rather than necessarily firefight. So there's a bit of a risk there, and I think that's, Angela sort of referred to that as a little bit as well. I think one of the things we do need to do is what's been a relatively stable area of our expenditure suddenly become very volatile in terms of bus service spending, and we need to be careful that we see these various different components of it in the way in which they're intended, rather than necessarily to end up sort of feeding an ever-growing monster in terms of the requirements that costs are coming through.
For those that might not know, that the government, part of the BSIP commitment was that we went into a sustainability review with the bus operators to find out what the most used services were, and it's come back that we could potentially lose 11% of our network, 62 routes. So I'm really worried, Dave, that potentially in bus services 2021 to 2022, Wakefield and Kirklees, we stepped in for 285,000. So have you done the modelling for if we lose 62 vital, socially necessary services, what that's going to cost us?
We haven't fully costed that out, because I think whilst what government asked was for bus operators and transport authorities to sort of identify what a sustainable bus network looks like when this money comes to an end, and that's a piece of work that has been done. That's where the 11% comes through. Clearly, it's a matter of judgment in terms of the bus operators as to how they want to manage their business going forward. So we're in a little bit of an odd position at the moment, where whilst colleagues are having conversations about options with them, the onus is on them essentially to come back and say what their sort of plans are going forward, and so we've got a number of different sort of scenarios that could play out there. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that whilst the 11% is an overall amount of money in the 63 routes, Some of that are whole services that might be withdrawn. Some of them are first and last journeys, Sunday operations and things like that. So to a certain extent, it might impact on 63 different routes, but it doesn't necessarily mean 63 bus services will actually be withdrawn. So to a certain extent, we will need to take and come back to yourselves with some thoughts around how we prioritise. And I think the priority probably does look around those communities who would lose a bus service altogether, but that shouldn't undervalue the fact that reducing an evening service impacts upon shift workers and evening economy workers and people like that. So there is no victimless outcome of some of these things, but some things we may need to prioritise further.
Thank you. So when our £2 fare kicks in, I'm very glad government have stolen our great idea. £2 and £4.50. So in September, we're using that to stimulate growth in passenger numbers, but that could also mean greater numbers of concessions. So has the financial modelling been done to understand what strain that could be if by some fluke our offer means that we've got more concessions also travelling?
Whether it generates more concessions travelling is an interesting point, because to a certain extent they don't pay now, so to a certain extent. But the interesting thing
they may have more confidence.
They might do, and generally how what we've seen is that the use of concessionary passes is tracking at around about 10% less than the number of people, of adult travellers that are travelling. Now that gap's closing a little bit, and the good weather might be a factor here. There's lots of it's quite fascinating to see the concessionary travel stats, because they do change with the weather, they change with lots of different factors. So it could be that concessionary travellers do start to come back, but they were heading down over the pre-pandemic period as well, and there's probably a bit of a more complicated sort of demographic thing going on in there as well. So, but I think we should, whilst concessionary travel might level out at less than pre-pandemic rates, we shouldn't necessarily bank on it from a financial point of view, because the other thing that I think we mentioned in the paper that we shouldn't lose sight of is that we've been paying the rate per journey to operators the same rate per journey since about 2017, and a number of reasons for that. Partly the pandemic, partly the fact that we'd had a fixed arrangement with them prior to that. Bus operators will try and come back with elegant arguments as to why we should pay them more per passenger based upon the fares changes that are having, and it's and there is a complicated spreadsheet model that is used to calculate this, but there's always the risk that the bus operators may use this as an opportunity to try and get more per journey out of the system. So it's a bit of a volatility around that as well. We can stave that off in this current financial year because of the way which we're doing the sort of phased transition. But I think early next year, well, I know, because as I said, they want to have that conversation with us.
We're cutting fares, Dave. We're not going to be bullied by the operators into paying them more for these fares.
Absolutely not, no. And I think we're alive to that as well.
Jane.
Sorry, just as we're getting deeper into concessionary fares discussion, I should probably declare an interest as somebody who's had a senior bus pass for some years.
No. Thank you. Mandy, then Matthew.
Does the introduction of electric buses change the cost model at all?
Dave.
The rollout of electric buses might actually be quite long in terms of impacting on the cost model. I mean, the Zebra scheme that we've recently approved once that's in and those buses are on the road, that's only 10% of the bus fleet. So I think there's quite a long way to go to the economics of this, actually moving away from the sort of reliance upon diesel and fuel. And the other factor is the cost of charging has gone up as well with the cost of electricity. So I think that it's a longer term impact on the economics of buses in terms of what the zero emission buses would do. But obviously longer term, less reliance upon the fluctuation of oil prices could only be a good thing, because that's feeding through here.
Thank you. And certainly our 111 buses are really welcome, but I was challenged on the fact that we were paying for electric buses because we top up from the cost of the what an operator would pay for an ordinary bus. We top it up to the electric. And I was challenged that why well, stop that then and support your bus network and pay for that. So saying it's two different funding streams, and it shouldn't be either or either. We need to get moving on electric buses, and we can't let the pandemic or government intransigence halt our ambition. Matthew.
It's like where to start, really, isn't it? It's so depressing completely. The 62 routes are there because they need to be there one way or another, where it's supporting work, isolated communities. So I'd be interested to know where they are, because I've got a funny feeling majority of these cuts will be within Arriva's network, not Wakefield, North Kirklees and South Leeds, James, part of your area as well. So I think we need to know where they are as soon as possible and start the conversation about what we can do to support these. It just makes complete mockery, though, of what we're trying to do with the transport fund and put bus routes in there, all these sort of things where people are saying to me on the street, why are you doing this when the bus is out there in the first place? I know that's for the council chamber to have that argument, but I just find it very, very depressing, that's all. But we need to have that information as soon as we can, Dave.
Thank you. It is massively depressing that the routes that are going to be cut are the least profitable, and it does make the argument for us going further towards franchising and trying to say to government, please, we are supporting 22% of the network already. Just let us get to where we're actually in charge and we can make these decisions. But I do feel your frustration, Matthew. Did you want to come back in, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's when we got clarity from the bus operators in terms of what we'll do next. Obviously, we will share that with members. But I've been sort of reluctant to the 11% at the moment is based upon a sort of piece of work that's been done rather than necessarily what the bus companies as businesses are going to do about it. But I think we can we've seen how it's gone over the last year in terms of where the impact the cuts are. And I think one of the challenges that this brings the authority generally, local transport authorities in particular, is that it sort of pushes in a dangerous direction where at an increasing cost, more and more of the bus network is subsidised, and yet the profitable bit is not able to cross-subsidise, and not the less profitable piece, and the taxpayers actually making up the difference. And I think that's it is a dangerous sort of path that this is sort of moving in, which is why I think the assessment of franchising and the bus reform and looking at whether or not there's a different way of doing this becomes even more important, because a model where all the non-profitable bus routes are subsidised by the taxpayer and the profits are made on the busy routes in the urban areas is not a model that helps the people Councillor Morley particularly is concerned about.
And if I could just reassure you as well, Matthew, that we've spoken to the bus companies in the strongest terms to hold their nerve. The BSIP money is coming, and they must help us. We helped them during the pandemic. They've got to get through to the point where the BSIP money can start to flow, and not to cut those services. So we're making that case that whilst the sustainability review would suggest 11%, you have a choice. Don't do it, and just take a hit for a couple of months to get us through, because we have to build. We have got to have a plan for growth, not manage decline. Ben, did you? Oh, sorry, Jane, and then Ben.
I just want you to look forward to the mass transit system, and I know it's early days, but part of that is about connectivity between bus and rail, really, and we could see some of those communities starved of the opportunity to get to the heavy rail, particularly for us in terms of going through the valleys. You have to have a bus to connect, or people are completely dependent in hilltop communities on cars, really, and we want to regenerate rail as much as the bus service, and they are interdependent, and it's part of looking forward to the mass transit system is that connectivity and interchangeability.
Really important point, thank you. Ben.
Thank you, Mayor. So a couple of points from me, if I may. Firstly, to Councillor Scullion's point, yes, and there's a paper coming to the Combined Authority meeting that seeks approval for revisions to the connectivity strategy to do just as you've said, that we do need to be mindful that the mass transit work isn't just about mass transit, it's about enhanced public transport capabilities across that connectivity network. So that's a really good point that you've made. I just wanted to say, I think that many of you made points at the beginning that the bus funding and finances are complex. I think there's an emphasis on us, and I've been communicating with Angela during this meeting to try and find easier ways and more transparent ways to bring the information back to you. I think we need to be clear about where our numbers are gross and where they're net. I think we need to be clear about the kind of services that those numbers are supporting. And I think, given the exceptional nature of the year that we think is ahead of us, we ought to be bringing you kind of monthly updates on how those numbers are moving and what the pressures are on those numbers, and whether we need to do that in private session or whether we can do it in public. We'll take a view on, but it'd be nice to be able to make it as fully transparent as we can. I think there are real risks around the falling away of government funding and the emphasis that puts on our numbers. But actually, when the Combined Authority budget was agreed in February, that locked certain budgets, and varying between budgets is a Combined Authority decision. So we need to look at whether, actually, for the forthcoming CA meeting, we need to bring back a proposition either to give budget flexibility or for you as a CA, in that context, to be able to move money between budgets, in particular between tender services and concessions. And then I think we do need to be much more transparent about the impact, both on the network that we see it as we see it, because we, as Dave says, there is work underway in terms of our estimates. They will give way to operator decisions about what networks they're going to be prepared to run and what deregistrations they're going to put forward, and we need to be able to keep up in terms of indicating the financial implications of those decisions, and keep in view the cross-subsidy factor that Dave's mentioned, that is quite important, because, as Dave says, that is going to place an additional burden on the public purse.
That's a really good suggestion. I'd like to take that away. I think it is such a, as Dave will know, it's so fast moving, isn't it? And we didn't know that government were going to have the £2 cap fare until a week before they announced it. So there's so much going on in this space. I'm assuming that'll all be forgotten now. We've got different politicians, who knows. But I like those suggestions, thank you.
It hasn't actually been announced yet. It's been in the media. but yeah, we are aware that officials have been looking at it, so we might find out more in the coming days.
But thanks, I think we need to be across this, don't we? And particularly if we're going to, as Baroness Veer suggested, we own our own bus company, we need to know the costs of that and what these other routes might cost us if they decide to walk away. Any further comments on bus? No, thank you. It's taken us to the end of the agenda, so we're on time, James, for your 12 o'clock. The next meeting, FRCC, is the 6th of September. And thank you so much for attending. And Mandy, thank you for stepping in for Mark. And it's all right, and you're very welcome to be here. Thank you.